Good evening and welcome to our first ever Inside City Hall session, which brings key City Hall leaders out to District 10 virtually at this point to help us understand how our city works, what's around the corner, and to help residents figure out how to get involved and participate in local government. So Jim Shannon, Budget Director, thank you so much for being here at the start of the budget season. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Cool. Yeah, that's not a problem. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, of course. And I thought, before we get into our hard-hitting questions, maybe you can just tell folks a little bit about what it means to be the budget director and how long you've been doing budget management.
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Again, hi everybody. My name's Jim Shannon, city's budget director. So I've been with the city of San Jose since 2012. I've been as the director since June of 2019. So if you're paying attention, that my first year as director was our pandemic year. So that was a nice introduction for me. But so the interesting thing about San Jose, first of all, is one of the few big cities in the US. So we're, the 10th biggest city in the US, but we have sort of a council manager form of government, which is a little bit unique amongst large cities. And so it's the city manager's job to produce a proposed budget for the mayor and council's consideration. And that's, we'll get into this later, I think, but, that's heavily influenced by the mayor's March budget message. But so part of my job is the budget office is that we're actually in the city manager's office. And in a lot of cities, you may see budgeting done as a function of the finance department.
Right.
But for San Jose, we've got the, there's a lot of, having the budget office with the city manager helps really make sure that we're in close alignment with your priorities as council members. We're, it's not too sort of out in the department hinterlands, but the budget sort of like front and center, really part of the city manager's decision-making process, wanting to make sure that kind of gives it the attention that it needs. So, so I get the good fortune to be here and work with a lot of departments as we try to figure out, what our city's budgetary position is, try to work through budgetary issues. We're a pretty lean organization, so there's a lot of things. Whenever we want to do something a little bit different, there's always probably a budget implication around that. And so,
right.
So that's, my office is always kind of lurking around the corner.
Yeah, no, I think it's great that you're in the city manager's office. And I think it's really important, from my perspective at least, that our budget decisions are driven by measurable goals and performance. And I appreciate that the monstrous 700-800 page doc that you put together every year does highlight a number of performance metrics. And I think it's great that you have that kind of view across the entire city. So why don't we dive into some questions? And I know you put together a few slides, which I really appreciate. So we'll automatically put those up. But the first thing I thought we could help folks understand is fairly simple but important question. What do we spend money on, and where does our money come from as a city?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we have a couple slides up there and maybe talk about that. And so maybe just starting off. So this is a little slide. It gives the entire city budget. So we've got $4.8 billion, which is a lot of money. And that funds everything that we do from airports to zoos. So we are a full service city. Airports, we treat our wastewater. We have a water department. We manage the recycling and garbage services. We do all the things that a normal city does too, like police and fire and parks and libraries. All that stuff gets wrapped into the $4.8 billion budget. Matt mentioned we got this, 700, 800 page budget document. That's just half of it. So we have an operating budget, and then we have a capital budget, which is just as big. And we have all of that is very, very public and detailed out in all those documents. We budget the dollars across 130 funds. We got about 6,600 positions, but that pie chart there kind of tells you kind of the big breakdown. So the stuff that we talk the most about, as a city and as, mayor and council talk a lot about, is the general fund, because those are the revenues that can be used for any governmental purpose. That's, when you pay your property tax bill, your sales tax bill, if you pay a business tax, that all goes into the general fund. It can be used for anything from police officers to libraries to parks to whatever else is a legitimate government purpose. That's what it can be used for. The rest of the city, almost 3/4 of the budget, are restricted in their use. So either the funding source in of itself by municipal code is restricted, or it's restricted by state law. So for example, we can't use money collected from your water bill and use that to pay for the library. You just can't do that, right? So most of the money that the city has is restricted for particular purposes, either for special funds like airport and wastewater treatment, garbage collection, or for capital funds like improving the sewer system, building roads, stuff like that.
And Jim, those special funds, just to interject, they're largely funded by user fees and are fairly self-contained enterprises. You mentioned the airport, for example. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So they are collected for a specific purpose and then used for that purpose.
Right. Okay. Great. And anything else you want to tell us about where the spending goes? I don't know if we want to dive into the general fund a little more deeply, since that is our discretionary portion of the budget.
It is our discretion. Yeah, it gets a little squirrely when you look at the entire city budget. So it's kind of too much to take in. So it's kind of nice to focus in on the general fund here, and I'll expand a little bit on the other uses in a second. But so if we got this pie chart looks at the expenditures by different types of expenditure grouping. So we do a lot of things in the city called CSA, and it's called City Service Area. So we try to sort of group up major departments into the areas where they are delivering the types of services they're delivering to the public. And so this pie chart kind of shows that at a very high level of where the general fund dollars are being spent. So like most cities, we spend, a lot of our money on public safety. So that red slice there is police and fire. So that's 47% to public safety. We've got a decent chunk of it going to strategic support that helps make the rest of the city function. Things like HR, the finance department, public works that does all the maintenance. You've got a few other departments as well there. The city manager's office, mayor and council is stuck in there too. So there's definitely, a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes that makes the city work, and that's that strategic support function. Then we've got things like neighborhood services, which are libraries and parks. Now, library has a significant chunk of funding in a special fund called the Library Parcel Tax Fund. So part of your property tax bill also pays a parcel tax for the library. So they have their own additional funding. Similarly, when you maybe sell your property or you buy a property, there's a transaction tax on that helps fund parks capital improvements. That's also not shown up here.
So Jim, those are, just to interrupt you again, those are either special funds or capital funds then? Is that what you're saying?
Yep. So okay. So that library parcel tax that you pay can only be used for library purposes. That's what we call a special fund. Right. And then that transaction tax on property, that's a capital fund that can only be used for certain types of maintenance, of some types of capital work.
Right, and then paving the road. So this chart again is just discretionary. So it's the breakdown's a little, I don't want to say misleading, but it could mislead if you didn't have the full picture. Something like paving the roads, I assume, is coming out of capital funds.
Coming out of the capital funds, correct? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
Great.
So you're exactly right. So you see that environmental and utility service, transportation, aviation, they're a really small component of the general fund because they have such large dedicated funding elsewhere.
Right.
And so definitely the picture is a little bit different. You sort of zoom out and look at the whole city budget perspective. But this is kind of, an overall snapshot. And then we have a few different types of reserves that we need to make sure that we maintain. But the biggest piece of it, though, you see that general purpose reserves is only 5% of the general fund. That's a pretty low dollar amount when you kind of figure out how big of a city we have. So we don't have a lot of extra reserves sitting around. Our earmark reserves, that 9% there, those are for specific things that we think are going to happen in the future.
Right.
So, and that encumbrance reserve is reserved for money that's already obligated to a different use. And so really, when we look at the general fund, that's all money that's obligated for, a budgeted purpose, aside from that 5% that's sitting in the general purpose reserves, which is really our emergency fund.
Got it. Okay, great. Thanks. Let's keep moving. What's next?
Movement. So I think if you go next is the kind of breaking it down a little bit more. So the last chart was like the functional, like what do you kind of do with it? Right. But then this is really, what types of expenditures do we have? And I always like to point out this one too, because like most cities, we pay people to do work. And so we see that I'm probably just a little bit busy, but there's this all the kind of purpley blue stuff there are our personal services components. And so that's about 58% of the general fund, which again is pretty normal. So that can range from 50 to 70%, depending on what type of city you live in. and but I also want to point out that's broken out by, salaries is 33%. Retirement is 21%, so that's a really big slice. And then we've got benefits about 4% for other sort of health and whatever other little benefits that we have. So, it's important and fair to point out that retirement is, one of the things that the city had struggled with in the past a lot. So when we, for your viewers out here who kind of lived through the last budgetary crisis we had back in the early or the late aughts and the early tens, we were really struggling coming to grips with our retirement costs.
Right.
Both market returns being very, very poor due to the Great Recession and coming to grips with the unfunded actuarial liability. That growth is stabilized, but now that's at a high level, and so
right.
But it definitely limits what we kind of spend on other items.
And that slice of the pie that's 21% is both funding, sort of pre-funding retirement, the investment fund for existing employees, as well as backfilling any shortfalls from the retirement system for retirees. Is that right?
Correct. So it's active participants paying in, and it's also the active for their future retirement, right. Also contributions for the past payments that weren't large enough, really, given the benefits that would ultimately be paid out.
And just so people have a sense, so you said it's stabilized now, meaning at around that 21% level. So you don't anticipate that going up much. And is there a point at which that would actually start to come back down and give us a little more flexibility in the general fund?
So for sure, it'll come back down. So the biggest component of that, or a really large component of that, is our unfunded actuarial liability, which is so essentially we just pay, like we have like a really big mortgage. So right. I think we have a really big mortgage we will eventually pay off. So by the 2040s, late 2030s, we pay off most of that unfunded liability. So, but for the next 10 or so years, that remains at a pretty high level, but then it will get a lot lower. The question is will it remain at that kind of steady 20%? Yes, if the projections of the retirement board actuary bear out, the market behaves, all that stuff. So it's yes, but there's a lot of caveats in there because
there's a lot of uncertainty around that. But when we pay off that mortgage, as you put it, and we're in the 2040s, still a little ways out there, I assume I will be out of office by then. You will, where would you expect that slice of the pie to go? Would it be about half that? Would it be about 10%? Or where do you think that would end up?
Oh gosh, I don't.
That's all right.
I'm gonna assume it's a lot less. I mean, that's probably about right. I mean, I would just be guessing a little bit, but it should be a lot less.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, sorry, I know we're still on our first question here, so we should keep going. I think you have another slide or two on this, right?
Do I have another one? Let's see what's the next one. Oh yeah, so this is, now we get into revenue. So
there we go.
Questions, Matt, you want to talk about expenses at all? Anything else, Matt, you wanted to chat about?
No, that's good. Let's talk about where the money comes from.
Okay, so again, this is just a general fund. All the other special and capital funds come from sort of specialized taxes or specialized fees or rates that go to fund those specific purposes. It's when you hear news in the paper about the city having budget problems or a surplus or a deficit or whatever, it's almost always around the general fund because that's, what funds a lot of what people think of as those critical services.
Right.
So what's good about San Jose is we would like to have more money, like most cities would, but the good news is we do have a lot of diverse sources. So we're not overly reliant on any one source. So the biggest slices of us here are, I'm going to ignore fund balance for a second and come back to that one. Okay. So property tax is the biggest ongoing revenue source in the general fund. That's where you pay your county property tax bill. If you're fortunate enough to own a home, you pay that, and that is our biggest component of the general fund. The next biggest is sales tax, and then when you get beyond that, we have other ones like the business tax, which is the tax you pay to operate a business. That's also has some interesting subcomponents, like we have a cannabis business tax, which is part of that. We have a card room business tax, which is part of that.
Right.
Then we get to franchise and utility fees, and these are sort of fees and taxes levied on either providers of utility service like cable or electricity or gas and the usage of those. A new one here is our real property transfer tax. That's Measure E. So that was on the ballot back in March of last year.
Right.
And that was approved by voters, although it just goes into the general fund and is available for any use. Council has been very specific about what they want to spend that on. So right now, all of that money goes toward affordable housing development and homelessness prevention. So that's good news there. But it's, it's pretty small component still. We've got a number of transfers and reimbursements between the special fund and the capital funds to reimburse the general fund for costs that it makes. And then we've got a whole slice of others. And some of these are pretty small, even though you'd think they would be pretty big. So for San Jose, for example, we have a transient occupancy tax. Our hotel tax is only about, it's a little bit less than 1% of the overall general fund, which is pretty small, which is a lot different than, say, San Francisco, which is heavily reliant on their hotel taxes. Now, we do have our hotel taxes, does pay for some stuff in a special fund, but the general fund component is pretty small. And so when we went back through the, we had to put our budget out for this current year that we're in. We were trying to forecast what was going to happen with COVID back in April of last year. And so the key revenue sources that may be interesting that are more economically sensitive will be things like sales tax and business taxes, for sure, are heavily influenced by what's going on in the economy. The property tax was one of the ones where it's normally a little bit delayed because the property tax is sort of set sort of like the prior year. So what we were concerned with property tax last year wasn't for what was going to happen in this current fiscal year, but what was going to happen for the next fiscal year.
Right.
But as you know, I mean, real estate's been good. I mean, it's been strong. So
it's held strong.
Property tax is doing well. But what's nice about this, so when we think of things like franchise and utility taxes, those are pretty stable depending on, doesn't matter what the economy is doing, it's more based on overall usage and what the rates are for those things. So that's kind of a nice stabilizing factor.
Right.
So, but maybe one of the challenges for, sorry, go ahead.
Well, just a question on that one, which is, I believe if I read the budget correctly, there's a utility tax related to landlines. Is that correct?
There is, yes, there is.
What happens when the eventual demise of the landline occurs, assuming that's going to happen one day? Is there a plan? I mean, do we just lose that revenue, and how significant is that?
Well, it's, I should have that handier. So we have a couple of we have a telephone utility, we have a telephone line tax that is pretty stable. We'd also have a telephone utility tax, and then we also have a cable franchise tax. And so, those elements, our telephone utility tax and our cable, are definitely our money. They're definitely going down year over year. And so it's not just people switching to cell phones, but it's also people cutting their cable line.
Yeah, cutting the cord.
And so that's a shrinking revenue source for us. It's also, there also are some prohibitions. So if you just have a data plan, so to the extent that cell phone plans are switching over to fewer minutes and they just go over to data. So there are regulations where that the tax cannot be applied to data. So it's actually it's a shrinking revenue source. And I'll pull that up in a second so we have that there, but it's a concern. It's a concern.
I know, right? I'm off script there, but I just was thinking that industry is changing so much.
Well, hey, let's keep going off script then. So just to write that point home, sales tax, right? So sales tax is a taxable sales is a proportionally shrinking segment of the economy. So as GDP grows, gross domestic product, right? Taxable sales grows at a lower rate. Because of
services.
Exactly, services and other things, right? So as the things that, if the type of items that sales tax would have applied to as in the past, we wouldn't need as high of a sales tax rate as we currently have. Right. And so that's kind of the challenge of managing a city's revenue stream, is that, we're in California, we're pretty restricted on what we can actually tax. It may not seem that way, but it certainly is. And so, kind of as the economy shifts, our revenue streams don't really keep up with it.
Right. So at the risk of losing my job, are cities and counties and states, I know there's been some work around capturing internet-based sales and applying a tax there. Maybe you can give a quick update on that. And then is the state considering a tax on services, or is that kind of a no-go topic?
The last one, I don't think there's any serious consideration, or else I would know about it. I mean, I think there's been talk. I mean, definitely been talk, because there's actually even a chart in the governor's the January budget release that kind of just shows the sloping downward line of taxable sales as a percentage of the economy. But I don't think there's an appetite for that probably. But the good news is internet sales. So there was a Supreme Court decision back in 2018, I think it was called Wayfair. And so I think it's North Dakota versus Wayfair. And so the Supreme Court decided that, hey, even if you're an online enterprise and you're out of state, the local jurisdiction still and the state should still be able to collect sales tax.
Right.
And so that was a brand new thing. And so we really started seeing the benefit of that this last fiscal year in 1920 and continuing on, which is really good timing because with all the other sort of brick and mortar things sort of shutting down, internet sales were super strong. So like our first quarter sales tax receipts for this fiscal year were only 5%, year over year below the previous year's quarter.
Wow.
And that's because internet sales were up 40%.
Yeah, right.
So it was a huge, buoy for us when it otherwise would have been an even worse situation.
That's fascinating. So do the Amazons and eBays of the world have to track where all purchases are made and then route that through the tax collection authority, or how does that?
Yeah, so it all gets run through the California Department of CDTFA, Department of Tax and Finance Authority, I think.
Yeah.
So they have to report, which sales were out of state, which sales were in state,
right.
And then that money then flows to. We don't get as big a slice of the internet sales unless the internet sale was originated in San Jose. We get sort of a lower slice of that, but we do have an agreement with eBay so that they are a sales tax entity in San Jose. So that's definite help to our revenue stream there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I know I took us off script. Anything else you want to say on this before we talk a little more about the impact of COVID? I think we fund balance.
No, we started to cover it. Yeah. So yeah. So no. I mean, this is got. I forget what the next slide is though.
Yeah. And Jim, did you mention fund balance and what that? So
I didn't. Thank you for that. So fund balance is really. It looks like this really huge slice, but there's a big component of things that are funded on a year-to-year basis that maybe don't get completed in 1 year. So fund balance is mostly funding that was allocated in a previous year that gets carried over into the current year to get finished being spent. And so let's say you've got a capital project where you need to rehab a building. Well, that building spans the fiscal year. So that unused money rolls over into the current year. And so it's not really an ongoing revenue. I mean, there's a small component that's an ongoing, but that's mostly just carryover funding from the previous year.
Got it. Okay, right. And that explains why our revenue collection for the general fund is actually lower than what's been budgeted, right?
Yeah, so our revenue collection, our ongoing revenue stream is closer to, about 1.2, 1.3 billion.
Right.
And, we have a fund balance, which gives us the rest. So
I see. Okay. Yeah, being a non-accountant, I was trying to figure that out, but that answers it. Okay, so why don't we, unless you have other slides on this topic, I don't think you do. Why don't we jump into how COVID has affected, and you actually started to do this. Maybe you can just summarize high level how COVID has affected both revenues and expenditures.
Yeah. So on the revenue side, all those things that are dependent upon, sort of the day-to-day economic activity have taken a hit. And when we were back like a year ago, in April, so we had to redo our entire budget last year within 60 days. So we just sort of started from scratch and tried to figure out what our economic impact would be. So we knew that things would be bad, would be things like sales tax, that would definitely go down. We felt pretty good about property tax because that was going to be a year in arrears. So the first year we weren't too worried about. Business taxes we knew would be hit, although there are components of that may have been buoyed. Like we thought cannabis sales would probably do all right, and they did do all right. Mm-hmm. But what we had, let's kind of finish going through this. We thought maybe there would be a bigger impact on utility taxes because people just maybe couldn't pay their bills because they were out of work. That didn't end up materializing, but that was a concern that we had. We knew that we were going to take a huge hit on our hotel taxes because there was no travel. All the major conventions were canceled, so we knew that was going to be a huge issue.
Right.
And then we also had assumed lower levels of parking and parking ticket, which we do get revenue from. Mm-hmm. And we thought we would get lower fee revenue from our parks programs because they would be shut down for part of the year. We didn't do family camp. We canceled the aquatics program. So that was, I think we'd thought all correctly along those same lines. But I think as we, learned throughout the year on the revenue side, the pandemic was just with us for so much longer than we anticipated. Although the bigger impact, like on sales tax, were actually not as bad. People still, although people were out of work and it's really impacted a segment of our community, that it still is a big issue. Others were doing well. They were working from home and they were still getting paid and they still had money to spend.
Right.
And so sales tax ended up being not as bad. There were a lot of online sales that really helped us there. So that was good. But what we did get wrong was those things that the day-to-day activity was really impacted due to the public health restrictions. So we have almost no revenue coming in from all of our PRNS, parks, recreation, neighborhood services programs. Happy Hollow has been mostly closed. We used to run some preschool programs, and the only ones that we do run now, we don't charge money for.
Right.
We had all the leisure programs aren't really happening. The community centers aren't really operating. So that was definitely, a big hit on the revenue side. Hotels, we always thought would be bad the first half of the year, and we thought they would maybe come back a little bit the second half of the year, but they were worse than we thought the first half of the year, and they haven't really come back at all. So, we had to make some adjustments there. The parking activity in the downtown and other areas has remained at really low levels.
Yeah.
So, we had to make some adjustments there. So from a big picture, we kind of balanced all out, but we definitely had a lot of variability.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, on the revenue side, but any question on that, Matt, before I dig into the expense side?
No, I think that makes sense. And I guess you're going to probably get into the fiscal stimulus a little bit as well, more on the expense side. No, that's really helpful. It's interesting. I guess the only question on that would be, you probably would be hesitant to do this, but as you forecast out, I mean, do you see at this point the parking and hotels and local business generated revenue starting to bounce back mid-year or late year? Is that, or what is your projection there?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have those bouncing back for sure, but they're bouncing back from pretty low levels. So, as an example, so the transient occupancy tax in the general fund in 18-19 was around 20 million. It's like at 5 million this year. So It's just, never seen levels that low. Right now we have it tentatively at $10 million for the following year, right? So in 21-22, we have it coming back. So that's a huge growth, right? That's massive growth, but you're only getting back to, about half of where you used to be. So that similar with parking levels too, we have some pretty strong growth, but still the levels that it's getting back to are pretty low. So
yeah, that makes sense. I think the hard thing to project is how much habits and behaviors have changed and how long it will take for them to maybe go back to what they used to be if they ever do. I mean, I assume I'm very bullish on our downtown, but it may take a little while for people to come back and businesses to come back. And maybe hopefully it's not, but it could be a slow recovery in that regard.
That is a wait and see aspect of it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. No, yeah, let's move on to the other side of it. So how has COVID impacted spending?
So, what's been really fortunate about the response is that, we've gotten a lot of assistance from the state and federal government over the past 12 months. So there's been, on the city side, we stood up our emergency operations center, in January of last year, as news of the pandemic started to come in. So we set up our EOC, and its need and its capacity just grew and grew over the months. Such that we were able to really spin up a lot of different services that the city had never done before. So the city, took over some coordination for food and necessities distribution throughout the community. We were helped, support our and protect, sort of the unhoused population in a very different way. We worked, collaborated really closely with the county in a lot of ways to help, get the word out about the public health orders. But, what's been really helpful is that there's been a large infusion of resources that the EOC has been able to take advantage of. And so all total, I think we've had about $350 million of external funding that has helped the city respond to and provide assistance during the pandemic. So almost, a big chunk of that, about half of that is related to, affordable housing and homelessness support dollars from the federal government. There's been a big infusion from, you may have remember the CARES Act back in the spring. We had some money from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That was about $178 million, which is really helpful. That was also pretty flexible. So we could do some innovative programs for that. So we helped folks. We had a local assistance program to help folks who needed help with various aspects of local economic recovery. We had some nonprofit assistance in there. We had some digital inclusion funding to help folks connect and help families connect that needed to do remote learning.
Right.
So, so it was a lot of resources that went out the door. The good news is, for the most part, we were able to leverage a lot of external funding to be able to do that. We did use a little bit of general fund funding, but we also captured some of the savings that staff that was already programmed to do normal work couldn't do that normal work. And so we, scooped up some of that savings and sort of repurposed that to help out with the pandemic. So it's really put, a big, this map, it's really put a lot of strain on the workforce to be able to sort of just pivot and kind of deliver all those services. But the good news is, we have had a significant influx of funding, and that doesn't count the American Rescue Plan that was just signed into law by the Biden administration recently. So that'll, we can talk about that when we talk about maybe the budget upcoming, but that's $223 million of additional local assistance that will flow directly to the city of San Jose that will help us out.
Yeah. And there's rental assistance and other direct transfers that are going to be very helpful to the community, which should also in turn help keep, sales tax and other economic activity hopefully boosted. So let's talk about that. What does the next year or two look like?
I think we might have the forecast up here.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so we do have the forecast. Okay.
Yeah, good.
So this is, so every year we try to be very public again, like about all the decisions that we recommend or any of the analysis that we bring forward. We write a lot about it because we want to be transparent. So we have around the end of February or the beginning of March, we always release a 5-year forecast, which looks at the general fund and a few other special and capital funds to say, hey, what does our financial picture look like? And when we really think about the general fund, what we try to do is give the council the best information to do some budgetary planning around. And so what we try to do is we try to figure, okay, where do we think the economy is going to be at next year and the following 4 years? And what will the revenues the city will receive resulting from that? So that's one piece of the picture, is how much revenue we're going to get in. And then we also try to figure out, okay, the city council has told us to provide a certain level of services. They've already approved. How much does that level of service cost? That means how much do people get paid? How much do the contracts cost? Is there any adjustments that need to be made? Is there any new state laws that we need to take into account that's going to force our spending up? Stuff like that. We try to figure all that out. How much do we need to contribute to the retirement system? All that stuff gets factored in. And then when we compare our ongoing revenues in the general fund against our ongoing base budget expenditures, we compare the two of those. And then that's going to tell us if we have a shortfall or if we have a surplus. And so, the bad news is that we still see ourselves in a shortfall next year. So if you look at this first year, 21-22, so what that means is that we have an ongoing shortfall of about $48 million in the general fund. So even though we see pretty strong revenue growth across a lot of categories, we're starting from a lower base level. So, and our costs really haven't changed too much. We did cut costs for sure, but so we're on uneven playing field between the revenues and expenditures based on what happened with COVID. So we've got our ongoing hole of $48.1 million.
And unlike the federal, sorry to interrupt you, but unlike the federal government, we can't just borrow. We have to ultimately balance that each year.
Totally. Yes. Yeah. We don't have any ability to borrow our way out of it. So we have to have that balanced budget.
Yep.
So the way to read this though is these are ongoing revenues against ongoing expenditures. So what this says is that if we reduce our expenditures, let's just say we get it all in reduction, we find a way to cut costs and reduce services by $48.1 million this year. If we do all of that, that means that next year we'll have a surplus of $3.3 million.
Okay. So it takes into account the prior year's adjustment.
Basically. Yeah, it assumes that you fully resolved your previous year's shortfall or you spent all of your previous year's surplus. That's what that means. But if you were just to, let's say we were just going to sell property to we'll just find some one-time cash to cover our shortfall. That does nothing for us. So if we just found a pot of money of $48.1 million, just use that to plug our hole, that $48 million pops up again in 2023.
Right. So because your operating costs are still at that level.
They're still at the level. So over the 5-year period, we have a sort of cumulative 5-year shortfall of $38.2 million. So that's kind of the way to read that. So it's not like we can just, white knuckle it out for 21, 22, and we're good the following year. We've got an ongoing challenge to deal with.
That's
I
an
mean, I think,
important point because we have reserves that could even, you can tell me the exact number, but could at least largely mitigate the one-time shortfall. But if you don't do anything about the underlying cost structure, you're going to blow through that money and be in trouble a year or two later.
yeah, exactly right. So yeah, so we have a budget stabilization reserve, which is $35 million,
Right.
which we had to spend a little bit from that last year. We're able to find some savings and add back to it. So that's good. That definitely helps us. I mean, more importantly, we've got the $223 million from the American Rescue Plan is going to be a substantial,
Yep.
and that can be used to offset revenue shortfalls. So that's, good news there.
But it's one time.
But it's one time. And, there's going to be, I think there's a need both to sort of shore up the city and help bridge us through, but also there's going to be a need to help the community with that funding too. So we can't just use that all for city purposes. So,
Right.
So we'll probably have to come forward with sort of a mix of, some ongoing and one-time solutions to kind of bridge us through here. But ultimately, we got to figure out how to resolve the ongoing shortfall.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I have a little text there, but this also doesn't take into account any of the other stuff. Like maybe we have a large backlog of deferred capital project or deferred maintenance. That's not part of this number. We have a number of services we funded on a one-time basis for a number of years, but aren't technically part of that base budget. So that's not seen. So that number, if anything, that shortfall is probably bigger.
Okay.
Like quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked a bit about revenues and costs. How can we grow our revenues? And I think residents would be especially interested in understanding how and if we can grow revenue without increasing the tax rate that they're paying. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the economic development department does a great job with this, but one of the challenges for San Jose is, as a big city, we have a smaller population during the daytime than we do at night.
Yeah.
And so most big cities, people come into the big city, they commute and they go to work and they spend a lot of tax dollars in the city, and then they go home and they sleep somewhere else. So San Jose is kind of the flip version of that. And so part of what our objective has been over the last number of years is try to keep a balanced focus on trying to grow our housing stock, but also really focus on business investment. So to the extent that we have sort of a higher jobs to resident ratio, then I think we're trying to get to 1.1, and we're a little bit below that. So the more jobs we have that take place in the city, the higher the tax revenue that's generated from it via business taxes for businesses that are in the city, or people who come to work here and they spend their dollars in the city while they're working. To the extent that we have more convention activity and we have more people that come into the city to stay in hotels and spend their dollars here. So a lot of the work on a long-term basis from the revenue side is really about developments and trying to get a good balance between jobs and housing. Because right now, San Jose was developed primarily as a residential community, and the council's been working hard over the past number of years to sort of balance that out better.
Yeah. So we have that imbalance. And then is there also potential to just generate more other, retail and other business activity? And is it possible that actually residential, if done right, quote unquote, could actually boost other kinds of business activity that would generate revenue, restaurants and entertainment, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think we're probably getting a little bit farther from my field, but I know that we do have a lot of planning work on urban villages to try to do that right, just like what you're talking about. So you have sort of balanced development that has housing in it, it's got retail in it, it's got commercial in it. So there is this way that you can sort of leverage smart development to help drive revenue growth, because ultimately you want to make sure you have revenues to serve the population that lives here and works here.
Right, exactly. Cool. Okay, thanks. So could you tell us just a little bit about how the budget process works and how residents can get involved?
Yes, I think I got one more, couple of slides here. So, so we like to think of the sort of three different slices here for the budget, and I'll try to spend, not trying not to get lost too much into the weeds here, but we start on the budget in October. So we think about the budget for a long time, and in any given time, we're also often thinking about three different budget cycles: the last one, the current one, and the future one. But really from the point from October through February on the right-hand side, me and the budget office and our department, we're trying to figure out what that base budget is. I talked about earlier, trying to get to that, what's our general fund shortfall or our surplus. So we're doing a lot of work on that right-hand side, trying to figure out what our preliminary forecast is. We give some direction to departments about, hey, we need some budget proposals to either, reduce our shortfall or find different ways to spend money more efficiently, culminating in the release of our forecast. Going over all the way on the left-hand side, we really want to encourage folks to have direct contact with their council offices and the mayor. There are community-wide surveys that go out. The mayor hosts a budget town hall in January and February, and asks people, to kind of have input in on their. There's a software called Balancing Act, where we're trying to measure people's preferences for different types of services and investments that they would like to make. And so there's really, that time for October through February is, really important to kind of have the community engage with the council offices and the mayor, because what happens then in March is the release of the mayor's March budget message, which really sort of helps drive the process. Because similarly, while the community is reaching out to the council offices, we're also going through a process with the council and staff to try to figure out what the council's priorities are. We have some old language here, Matt, for city council priority setting process, but we just finished up the roadmap exercise last week, which is a key input in the budget process. Hey, what are the big change initiatives we need to focus on as a city?
Right.
And so we kind of trying to assess. From October to February, we're trying to assess, okay, what is our shortfall on the staff side? And then the mayor and council, sort of what are the sort of the high level city objectives? And also then the community is weighing in on that component, because you guys are always obviously influenced by what your residents tell you.
Yep.
And just as a staff person, when I first got into city government, even in a different agency, I was always impressed by how much, if a resident talks to a council member, it makes a difference. Let me just tell you, it makes a difference. It makes a difference.
Absolutely.
So it's definitely the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, the priorities I brought forward were driven directly by my experience knocking on doors and receiving a lot of calls and emails from residents. So that, I mean, we really do strive to be responsive. And I thought the mayor's budget memo was also very responsive to the community's concerns with whether it's the homelessness or some of the beautification issues or connectivity. I mean, so we'll put that in the comments for people to read. I think it's 20 pages, but it's actually not a bad read.
Yeah, it is. And I think the next slide then talks about the stages after the March budget message, if you have that.
Let's see if we have that one.
I think it's next.
Oh, wow. Just keeps going. Look at that.
Just keeps going. So I'll just real quick, but so, the March message there gets released, and it's that middle box there on the top. That really provides the driving interest for us, or the driving direction for us to develop a proposed budget. The city manager releases at the beginning of May. And then we've got a couple ways then for the public to get directly involved, understanding that budget and making comments on it. And so there are city council study sessions on the budget itself.
Yep.
I think, we'll make sure that it'll be public, but I think May 12th they start. I think it's May 12th through May 17th is when the study sessions on the budget happen. But there will also be, the mayor's office coordinates community meetings on the budget to kind of say what's in the budget and take any comments or questions about what folks want to see changed in the budget, because there are modifications to the proposed budget that the mayor recommends based on the input from community, from staff, and from his council colleagues, which culminates in the June budget message, which says, hey, adopt the city manager's proposed budget with all these changes. And then that becomes our adopted budget.
Right.
And so there are also a couple of formal public hearings where the public is asked to weigh in and comment. There's one in May and there's another one again in June. And we'll make sure to have that all published when we have the budget document released.
Awesome. Okay, and then before we jump into a few questions from community members, I have to ask my favorite question, which is, to what extent is the budget process driven by the goals we've articulated and performance metrics that tell us to what extent our strategies for achieving those goals are working?
So I would say it influences it a lot, with the caveat that we have a lot of fiscal constraints that are around us. And so, even in the recent good times, we had very little additional funding that was being available to restore services that were cut a decade ago. But
Right.
using performance metrics to identify, how those should be prioritized were really important. We've got, for example, if we look at performance measures for the fire department, and I think we got a couple here, the big ones we have these dashboards for all of our city service areas, all the departments. We have various performance metrics. These are pulled off of the auditor's website, which also tracks all of our key dashboards.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
Yeah, it's a great resource. And so you can see here that when you look at our response times for police calls and for fire calls, we are mostly below target, right? So the target are the black dashed lines, and the actuals are the red bar charts. And so you can see that we are below. So I mean, what this tells us is that we need to find better ways to make sure that we can try to increase our response time for especially police calls, priority 1 and priority 2 calls. Priority 2 calls for fire department we're doing pretty well on, but we're still shy on the fire side. That was a reason why we had, so for the Measure T bond program, that's why we needed to add some fire stations, because the fire department a few years ago did a really good job breaking down the response time between different components. So how long it took to receive a call, how long it took to change out into their uniforms, how long to get out of the fire station, how long to travel to the
Right.
destination. And so we can control the stuff of when we receive the call to when we leave the station, but
Yep.
from the station to the incident is dependent on geography. And so,
Right.
we definitely knew that we needed to make investments for additional fire stations. The problem with that, when you add a new fire station, you need to add a new engine company. And so it becomes pretty difficult to add additional personnel and engine company when you're in a shortfall. But I mean, I think the city council has made that a priority. Similarly with police, we definitely had a reduction in sworn policing over the past decade. And so that's, we see that in our response time metrics here. There's a separate process about reimagining policing that is going on. So we hope that will sort of yield some benefits there, but probably looks like we need to have some additional investment in public safety services in whatever form that takes to help us out with the response calls. But then we have things that are more mundane, like we really looked at sanitary sewer overflows, like when your sewer pipe overflows.
Yeah.
We looked at the incidence of sanitary sewer overflows per 100 miles of pipe and realized that we needed to do some more investments on the maintenance side to be able to respond to those faster, to get the overall number of those overflows down and get our response times to those lower. And so that was one of the reasons why we had increased our resources for that a number of years ago, or a couple of years back. But then there are other things that it would be, if we were purely solely driven by only the performance data, we could shift mass portions of our budget around to go, we're going to stop doing X and we're going to do Y. But there are real limitations about what you can stop funding and what you can start funding. And so we kind of have to, we're heavily influenced by the performance measures and the activity workloads, but it's all within the constraint of sort of what the fiscal environment is.
Yeah, and my observation is that it's largely at the departmental level, as you're describing here, which is great to see. I mean, it's nice to see police priority 1 response time starting to creep back up and get closer to our target there. So that's positive. I think doing that performance management within departments is really important. I think, to your point, though, the challenge we face as a resource constrained city is we're trying to do a lot. And so I'm, as you may have heard, my push lately has been for city level goals that maybe push a little bit of consolidation, or at least focus on a smaller set of priorities. Yeah. I do think you're right, though, that the ramifications of that are not so simple. I mean, it may involve, cutting expenditures. It would have to probably involve cutting programs and expenditures in other places if we really wanted to prioritize. I have no doubt we could improve service delivery in our highest priority areas, but then there would be a real trade-off there, and that's always hard.
Right. That's
yeah. So anyway, I'm sure we'll be talking about that more at council. So this is great. Why don't we jump into a few community members' questions, And one that came in early here on the webinar was a question I think you may have answered, but let me just make sure. So please explain the degree of the unfunded pension liabilities of both police and fire and federated pension funds and how it affects available funds for essential city services. So we did hit on that, but maybe we can just give people a sense of roughly what it means in terms of the general fund budget.
Yeah, so the unfunded pension liabilities is what's our term we use for it is unfunded actuarial liabilities. I mean, the good news is that we have a plan to pay it down. The bad news is it's like a really big, expensive mortgage, and so it represents all of our retirement costs. Represent about 20% of the general fund. The UAL is a very significant component of that. I don't have that, off the top. I know we have it in our forecast document, but it's a pretty substantial amount.
Yep.
And I'll try to pull it up before the end of the session here. But it is, it's a definite limitation on the amount of services that we can expand. Now, I think the city has done a lot of heavy lifting over the past couple of years, and San Jose has been kind of at the front of getting a better handle on the retirement costs. So we had a couple of ballot measures, Measure B in 2012, Measure F in 2016, which established a two-tier system for the retirement plan, and codified some of the changes with Measure F in 2016, so that we have a path forward. And
Right.
so that's really good. What council has also directed us is that we are coming back in, because we've done a bunch of work on the benefit side, we're coming back on the cost side. So at the end of April, we have a study session scheduled to look at pension obligation bonds. Because we're in such a low interest rate environment, does it make sense to issue a separate bond, so to use bond funding to pay down a pension obligation, because the debt on that bond, that interest rate is lower, hopefully, than our rate of return in the investment funds. And so that's a way so we can lower costs potentially substantially. It's not without risk, but that's something that we definitely want to look at, because it does crowd out the ability to pay for other services.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to digging more into that one. I definitely have some questions and a few concerns about pension obligation bonds, but it's an interesting concept. We had another question asking if the slides will be available, and actually the entire conversation with the slides will be posted to both Facebook and YouTube, and so you'll be able to watch this at your leisure. We had a question about property values have been going up, which has provided a windfall for local government. I think that's accurate this year. Property values have not declined from what we've seen in terms of property tax revenue due to COVID. So that's been positive. There was another question about what goes into paying a person who works for the city. I think we talked about retirement, healthcare. Is there anything else? And then obviously the base salary. Anything else about that personal costs category that we should talk about?
I don't think so. I mean, it's the salaries is the biggest component, and then retirement is a very big component. I think we had the slide there. It's like 58% of our budget is personal services or paying people. Yeah. Of that amount, that we had 30% was salaries and 20% was retirement. But no, those are the biggest components. So it's salaries, it's healthcare, it's small other benefits which aren't a large cost component, and then retirement. Those are the main elements. Yeah, and just to clarify for folks, because I think from the questions, I just want to make sure this is clear to people. For many businesses, particularly service-oriented businesses or entities like government, personnel costs are typically quite high, often 60-70%. So I think there might be a little confusion about whether or not there's a trade-off there with services, but in fact, many of our services are in fact delivered by city staff. And so when we talk about core services, that's often, we're talking about police and fire and the people maintaining the parks. And even something that's being funded through the capital budget, such as road paving, still requires city staff, which is again, personnel costs. So I just wanted to make clear to folks that it's not just people like me sitting at their desk at City Hall. Actually, I'm sitting in my garage, but cool. Let's see here. Any other? And just to go back to that, so the unfunded actuarial liability is about $220 million a year in the general fund. Okay. So 220? Yeah. Out of
1.5, but the actual revenue collection is more like 1.2. So which number would we compare that to?
I mean, it's easiest just to, I just do it to the adopted budget because that's easily recognizable amount. So,
Yeah.
so
So we're somewhere around 15%, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So about 15% of the general fund, which again is the 1.5 of discretionary budget out of the total city spending across capital, general fund, all the services, all the enterprises. That's closer to, you said 4.8 billion total?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be interesting. Have you ever looked at across all three of those categories? So general, special, and capital, ever tried to just break it down by type of service that's provided to the public? Because when somebody talks about something like roads, they don't see that reflected in the general fund, but it's part general fund, part capital fund, right?
Yeah. I thought about that as I was putting together you kind of preempted me a little bit for some of the questions, and I don't have anything that's super handy. I know we've done that in the past, but I'll have to think of a way that makes it pretty clear. And I think that's an interesting point that probably doesn't get underscored enough, is that we do a lot more than just in the general fund. We talk about it a lot, but there are way more services that we provide that's just in the general fund. So I'll take that as some feedback, Matt.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'd be very curious, and I think our community would be as well. I think we hit on pretty much all the questions I saw come in, and we are getting close to an hour here. So my team will laugh because I told them I was going to try to keep it closer to a half hour, but of course, I'm never able to do that. Is there anything you want to leave folks with? Any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I just, budget is always like arcane topic, and it's always very complicated, but if you're interested in the budget, and I mean, the budget is really how the city funds its services. So to the extent that you learn a little bit about it, what I would recommend, if you're all interested, all of our budget documents are really super long, but we normally do a pretty good job in the transmittal message from the city manager or the executive summary that really lays out a lot of the different components that are in any document. So you can get a pretty good sense of our operating budget or our capital budget or our forecast just by reading, the 15 to 20 pages of the transmittal message. Gives a good flavor of what's going on in the city from a budgetary perspective, and just kind of having that knowledge just makes you that much more informed about, weighing in and pressuring Matt to do one thing or another.
Absolutely. And when does the new one come out? That's when the budget's released?
So our capital budget will be released on April 26th, and our operating budget on May 3rd.
Great. Okay. So people can find that. We'll share it, of course, to social media and all that, but that's when that transmittal message would come out.
Correct. That's when it'll come out. And then we'll also, I'm sure the mayor's office will then publish shortly thereafter, the community budget meetings will be probably in the next, toward the end of April. Those will be scheduled for May too, which will be a great time for the community to kind of come out.
Great, and we'll be sure to publicize those. All right, well, Jim, thank you again. Really appreciate you taking the time, giving us a walkthrough. This was great, and we'll post the webinar to Facebook and YouTube. Appreciate the members of the community who came out and asked some great questions, and look forward to bringing you future episodes of Inside City Hall. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great evening. Take care.